Hello and welcome to the Rotary Club of Leicester weekly meeting. It's Monday the 28th of June and I'm just seeing a few new faces. Welcome again, once again, Muriel, to have you with us again. Any other guests? I can't see any other guests, but a few faces I haven't seen for a while. Serge, good to have you here. Louise as well. Tara, good to have you back from India. Okay, do we have any greetings from other clubs? Oh, and Pam as well. Good to have you with us, as always, Pam.
Thank you, Leicester Novus.
Thank you. And any other greetings from other clubs? Okay.
Sorry, Mephrina said to say hi, and she can't make it today, but she's having some exams at school.
Okay. Wish her all the best.
Will do.
So in terms of our projects, well, obviously you'll all know it's handover next week. So we'll be going through, I'll be summarizing my year, and then I will hand over to Scott. We're tentatively planning to hold it live together. So we'll meet at maybe Scott's office and do it there. And then Scott will tell you all about the exciting things he's got planned for his year. So I'm very keen to hear more. And so in terms of projects, everything's ticking along pretty well. Dan is doing a great job with the Netherhall project. I did see an email this morning that we have now selected a winning design for the garden at the Netherhall school, which is a special needs school in the Hamilton area. And so we're looking to award the prizes possibly on Wednesday. There's some cash prizes from our club to the students from the neighbouring Orchard Mead Academy. So the actual garden will be implemented at Netherhall School, but the winning design came from an adjacent school, students at an adjacent school. And they've been very impressive. I judged a few of them, and it's been great to see the students get involved, and great for the club as well to be involved with other schools and organisations. So that's gone really well. Dan has done a fantastic job. If she was here, I'd thank her. But I'm thanking her in her absence. So hopefully we'll get some pictures from Wednesday. In terms of our food bank projects, they're all going very well. My thanks to Simon for running a fantastic, Simon and team, and his fantastic group of volunteers and golfers for raising over £4,000 for 2 charities. Half of it went to our food bank appeal, and the other half will be going to the Gondar appeal, which, as you will all know, Richard Power is responsible for. So more funds will be directing there to help out with the hospital that he set up in Ethiopia. So that's all going very well. And at this point, I'll hand over to Barry for any secretary's notices. Okay, none. Any other comments or notices from any committee chairman or women? No? Okay, wonderful. So I'm now going to hand over to our speaker, Bob Maskall. He's a retired RAF pilot, and he's going to be telling us about his life, the life of ups and downs. So please take it away, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Samdeep. Let me just share my screen and we'll get started. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to give you a talk this afternoon. I will bring greetings now from my club of Bangor and President Steve. And come the 1st of July, it'll be President Kate, who's my wife, who's taking over as president. So I bring greetings from the Bangor Club and wish you all well for the forthcoming year. I also you should never start with presentations with an apology, but I do apologise to Rodney and Pam because I think this will be either the second or possibly even the third time they've heard this talk. So on that side of it, they're obviously gluttons for punishment. So I can't. But yes, I've been asked. Again. I've been asked just to give a chat about my life of ups and downs. I've spent over 30 years in the Royal Air Force. I'm still an instructor, albeit as a civilian in the flight simulator. So I still spend a lot of time doing much of what I've done for the previous 30 years, and I've done this now for nearly 10 years. So it's a long and interesting, I hope, career. Only going to look at some of the highlights today, and the odd little mishap that happens, as often is the case when you're dealing with mechanical things and aircraft weather and all the other things like that. So without further ado, let's move forward. Just to prove that I was young at one point, that is me in the front row. This was my very first training course way back in 1979, which is a bit scary when you think about it. But that's the sort of size of a course in those days. There was 12 to 15 people. At that time, this was at RAF Cranwell. There were 3 squadrons teaching pilots. Of each of those 3 squadrons, they had at least 3 courses running at any one time. And there were 3 stations doing the same thing. So you can see the numbers of pilots that were going through at that time was absolutely phenomenal. Nowadays, there's 1 station and they're doing about 3 to 4 per course. And that's 1 course at a time. So it's a very, very different Royal Air Force from when I joined in the late 70s, early 80s. Having done all my training, gained my wings at Royal Air Force Valley, I then moved on to my first tour, which was on this old beast, which is the very, very first jet bomber in the world. It's the English Electric Canberra. And as you can see, it's a fairly old beast, twin engine. And this was a modification on that original bomber variant. And those little bubbly bits on the nose and the extra extended bit on the tail, they were jammers. And we were in the role of actually training our air defence assets of the day against jamming. So we would jam their radars and they would have to operate through that jamming to try and still, either if it was an aircraft, get their missiles to fire, or if it was a ground base, for them to work through and guide the fighters to us. So it was a busy role, but quite an extensive role, because we worked all over Europe, training other NATO bases as well. So it was an interesting role. These old beasts were over 40 years when I flew them, and I joined my first tour at the ripe old age of 21, and it was a crew of 3. Obviously myself as a pilot, we had a navigator, and we had an air electronics operator who was operating the electronics for the jamming. Now, just to give you an idea, that was me at 21. My average crew, or my first crew I had, the average age was 42. So it was quite an old bunch of people that I was working with as a ripe 21-year-old. So there was a lot of learning to be had, shall we say, because they'd been in the Air Force probably around that time, 20 or 30 years as well. And a big, expansive career of people, and very, very interesting, fascinating to do. Now, the Canberra, being an old aircraft, it was designed in the 40s, came to life in the early 50s, had a very, by modern standards, a fairly antiquated way of starting it, in as much as this gentleman's putting a cartridge into the front of the engine, which is basically a cartridge full of gunpowder. You'd wind it forward, and then you'd electronically fire that cartridge from the cockpit when you started the engine. That sent gases through into the engine, started it spooling round, and eventually the engine got to self-sustaining once you added the fuel. The reason I show this one in particular is for a ground run, hence the red basket around the outside there, just to stop any rubbish getting into the engine when you're testing it. But obviously normally that wouldn't be there. But these are the way we started the aircraft. You don't normally start engine 1 on the left first, then engine 2 on the right. And it didn't always go to plan, as you can see from this one. This was one of my first mishaps. I was sat on the ASP in an RAF Germany base, ready to go home. I'd started my number 1 engine. I pressed the starter for the number 2 engine, and instead of all the gases going down the engine, you can see there must have been a weakness in the cartridge itself, and it blew the front of the engine effectively. Those pieces that you can see in the top right-hand corner were collected afterwards, but they went 200 and 300 yards all over the ASP. Fortunately, nobody was injured, and obviously no other damage done as well, which was also fortunate. When we start the Canberra, you always have the door open so that if something were to go wrong, you can make a quick exit. And one of the ground crew actually stood under the door when this fired on his side, and the piece hit the door, because I heard it hit the door, but as I say, fortunately it didn't hit him either. So we were very lucky on that day, but it was quite a shock to the system. This was a Friday morning. Luckily, they had a spare jet that could come and pick us up, and we didn't have to spend an additional weekend in Germany, which pleased my wife at the time, without a doubt. Having moved from Canberra's, I then moved on to an instructional tour on the Jet Provost, which you saw earlier behind the training team I had. And then I moved on to more interesting, from my point of view, fast jets. And this is the British Aerospace Jaguar, an Anglo-French design. And both the French Air Force and ourselves flew them for many, many years, as do in fact, the Indian Air Force still fly them today. Quite novel in as much as this is in the Gulf War fit, which I had played some part in, and quite novel in as much as the missiles were in over-wing variety. So they fired perfectly normally, used exactly the same way, but very unusual in as much as the missiles were fired from above the wing. And the other uncanny thing is the Jaguar was never the best as far as engine power is concerned, but the missiles in the over wing variety actually didn't add any drag, which was a godsend as far as we were concerned from the Jaguar point of view. But my primary role, you can see underneath the center of the aircraft, a very big, what looks like a pod, but that was a big bunch of cameras. And my primary role was photo reconnaissance, and we were used extensively going out taking photographs of enemy targets, enemy role, anything at all that the RAF were interested in. We'd be out taking photographs, and those cameras were such that we had one facing front, we had 4 that basically spread from horizon to horizon across from left to right, and 1 that faced straight down. And that enabled us to get a really good, clear picture of anything that we wanted. Primarily designed for a low level, but not exclusively so. And we did a little bit of high level as well. Those films were wet film. They weren't the digital variety you get nowadays. So it was quite a process to get them in. And basically, they were so slick and very clever. Within 15 minutes of the aircraft shutting down, all the film had been taken out of the pods, processed in the machines, and on the the light table here where they could be processed. Any target which I passed, there was a button in the cockpit that I could click as I went past it, and a little annotation would appear on all of the film, so that the photo interpreter who's bending over the scene here can actually whiz straight to the markers and get all the 5 lines of film, if necessary, lined up exactly where we're looking, so we can be finding the targets very quickly, and thereby the intelligence can be processed quite quickly as well. One of our tasks, our NATO task, was to regularly go to northern Norway, and that was our role should ever the Russians' hordes have invaded. As obviously in the 1980s it was always a possibility. Therefore we had to go there regularly to practice. Also, one of the regular things that happened is that Russian ships would come out of their yards in the northern part of Russia and come across North Cape round Norway, and this is one of those very, very large battleships, brand new at the time. This was early 90s. It's one of their very, very modern warships of the time, and also surprising to all of us as we went hunting for it over the North Cape, it's actually very big. It's about at least as big as the Queen Elizabeth type aircraft carriers we see nowadays in the UK, and this was enormous. And the problem that most of our aircraft had when we went to go and take photographs of it was actually standing far enough away from it to get a decent photo of the whole length of it, so you could see it as a full picture. And I was one of the few of the day that actually got a photograph. If you fly right past it, all you get is a little mast or a little aerial or nothing much else, whereas getting the full picture was actually quite a challenge. And that one came round North Cape one day. They must have got fed up with the sight of our squadron, because we were literally, every aircraft that got airborne was going to have a look at it and take a photograph. But it was all gaining intelligence of the day. Gulf War came around. I was one of the first, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990, I was called in from my leave, and we were one of the first squadrons to be deployed to the Gulf area in that time. Initially to Oman, and then moved up to Bahrain a month or so later, when space and also various permissions came about. Our primary role before the war started was to go and get pictures of our tanks and armoured vehicles in the sand environment, because we wouldn't have seen them in that time, and also to get as much intelligence as we could about the Iraqi forces if we could get close enough. But we were operating exceedingly low. As you can see, you can probably notice there's two shadows here on this one. The dark one, the one at the bottom, is me taking a photograph of this other jet as we're flying. He's flying at about 60 feet and I'm about 100 feet over the desert. But that was our main tactic, was to stay low and fast and keep out of the sight of radar. And our primary aim was to take the photos of our own troops initially, and then, as I say, to look at the Iraqi forces. After the Gulf, we then went back to the same area, but this time to northern Iraq. And you may remember that after Gulf War I, the remaining forces of Saddam Hussein were giving a lot of hassle to the Kurdish people in the north of Iraq. And there was a no-fly zone set up by the various Western nations to try and stop them being attacked by aircraft. And also we were patrolling the area regularly. So the next August, I was actually deployed once again, called in off holiday, which seemed to be getting a bit repetitive at this stage. And we were out again deployed to a place called Incirlik in Turkey, where we then regularly flew into the northern part of Iraq, monitoring the Iraqi forces and their movement. We had to monitor where they went, and if we couldn't find them, we obviously had to go and search for them. So it spent quite a lot of time wandering all over the northern part of Iraq looking for their forces. On one occasion, I was flying past one of their encampments, mainly to take photographs of equipment like this. But as I noticed and flew past, this air-to-air gun was actually tracking my aircraft all the way around as I went past. Fortunately, it wasn't doing what this one is doing and actually firing, because it fires at a ridiculous rate of knots. And had it been radar laid, it would have been not good from my point of view. But they were practicing as well as we were, and I think that the main reason is they were following and just tracking us through in case we did something that they weren't expecting. After the Iraq wars and Kurdish and what have you, we also did lots of big exercises, of course, and one of those exercises was an exercise called Maple Flag, where we used to practice with all our NATO allies in this place in Canada, and 3 or 4 weeks out there was usually part of a sort of big campaign, effectively, of aircraft, and we would be flying in ultra low level to drop bombs on simulated targets. One advantage, of course, of going there as Brits, we were invited to the Edmonton Air Show, and we spent a very interesting and fun weekend in the middle of that exercise at the Edmonton Air Show. And as we departed, we did a fly past of the crew and said, as a thank you. What I didn't realise, however, was that all Canadian hangars have videos on them, and someone complained, and my boss was not very happy when he heard we'd done the fly past at the end of the display. So we were met by him as we got off the aircraft at the far end, which is a bit disappointing, but still good fun and still worth it. Now, you may be surprised to see an even older aircraft as part of my sort of highlights and things of the last 30 odd years, but this is a Liberator. And just before I left Jaguars, I had the honour of this Liberator was coming across from America as part of the celebrations for, I think it was the 50th anniversary of the Americans joining World War II. And we had the task of meeting this Liberator as it was travelling across from Greenland to Iceland to Scotland, and then down to eventually end up at Norwich Airport. And we were at Coltishall, which is just up the road, and our aim was to go and meet this and escort it in. Myself, just in the middle there, and my boss on the right, we got an aircraft. And the big problem is the Liberator, being an older aircraft, its absolute max speed is about 200 knots. Now, to put that into perspective, the Jaguar used to get airborne at 170 knots. So we were really, he was at his full speed, and we were really very much at our probably slowest flying speed we could be. So we got airborne with with all the tanks off, limited amount of fuel, and then escorted this in with us, with him with his nose fully down as he was at full speed, and us sort of hanging on in there with our nose high up, trying to gain as much lift from the very small wings that the Jaguar has to try and keep flying. Fascinating time. My only regret was I know there were lots of photographs taken from the little windows on the left-hand side of us in formation with them. And my only regret was that we didn't actually manage to get hold of any of those. But this was one taken once the crew had landed in Norwich. After Jaguars, I moved on to what's known as the Central Flying School, and I became an examiner of other pilots effectively. And the Central Flying School is like the Ofsted of the Royal Air Force training side of things. We are there to keep up standards, and we are there to monitor training and instructor training. Big advantage for me as a pilot's point of view, I had to be current on 3 different types of aircraft. The Tucano in the left-hand side, the black one, the Hawk T Mark 1, which is the one on the right in the red arrows colours, and also the Jetstream at the bottom there, which was used for multi-engine pilot training. So it was great being able to be current on 3 different types. It meant a lot of extra simulator rides and things like that, but it was still good fun, and a lot of different types of flying, which was excellent. Anything from teaching a multi-engine pilot to join the airways and fly an instrument approach, to sitting in the back while the Red Arrows do their display in Cyprus and making sure they're not doing anything odd or strange or wrong with the aircraft to achieve the aim of the performances that they do. So it was a fascinating time. The other advantage, of course, was that in those days, the RAF used to regularly get invited to other air forces to go and offer their advice and help on training. And I managed to go to several different countries over the time I was with the Central Flying School, including South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and numerous other places, all with the aim of passing on our knowledge and also receiving knowledge from them, because they do different things differently, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was wrong. The aircraft in the top left-hand corner was the one I flew in Ethiopia, and that was an L-39. I forgot the name of it, but L-39, and it's a very similar aircraft to our Hawk, albeit very much heavier to fly because it doesn't have the same hydraulic controls that the Hawk has. At the end of our 2 or 3 weeks in Ethiopia, we're all presented with national dress by the Ethiopians, and you can see us all set up there. My boss in the big black, yellow and red colours of the country, and others in various other garb, including the little feather things to shake away the flies as we go. But a fascinating time and very different. Unfortunately, they don't fly as much out there at the moment because obviously civil war has been rife through the country for many, many years, which is a great shame. Towards the end of my career, I came back to flying the Hawk, and I moved to Royal Air Force Valley in Anglesey, which is where I now live, and continued primarily instructing instructors to fly and instruct our students. This was one of those sorties. I'm sat in the front of this aircraft and my student instructor is sat in the back. This happened to be a guy I knew very well, and we'd known each other for many years. And there's an area around Wales known as what is known as the Machynlleth Loop, which is a big circle of valleys which is a one-way system around, and you'd fly down one way, back up the other, and back to the same point. Now, obviously, we knew where that was, but so do a lot of other people, and this was a prime area for aircraft spotters and photographers. They used to sit at one particular part or 2 particular parts of the Machynlleth Loop waiting for us to come through so they could get decent photographs of all sorts of aircraft that would fly through this area, because to get from North to South Wales, you almost always, unless you went over the sea, had to go through this part. When you're teaching an instructor to fly low level, to teach it, what would happen was I would fly it and teach him how to teach as we go around the valleys. And then the second time round the loop, he would teach me as the pretend student to fly the loop as well. And on our first time around, he was obviously giving all the patter to teach me how to fly the valleys. And we just towards the end, we said, well, we've seen the photographers. Maybe we should just fly straight over the top of them and at low level rather than going down the side where we should have been. Anyway, towards the last bit, I took control as the student and was about to demonstrate. And just at the last minute, I thought, well, no, we really shouldn't go straight over the top of them. It was so we just kept to one side. And this photograph was taken as we went past. You can see from the background, the cameraman was obviously panning quite quickly, and the guy in the back just waved as we went past. However, within less than 24 hours, that photograph was on the internet. So it's just as well that we flew past and not directly over the top, because it could have been a much more interesting photograph and probably a more interesting chat with my boss at the end of it as well. So it was a late decision, but probably a wise one. Now, most pilots, in fact all pilots, like to have the same number of takeoffs as they like to have landings, because obviously you don't want any sort of big mishaps in the middle of it. This was the closest I ever came to ejecting, the closest I ever came to an aircraft crashing, and thankfully it all ended happily. But most importantly, this was an argument with a buzzard. We were doing low level. This was way back when I was still under training. There was an instructor in the back seat and I was in the front. As we pulled up to go over a hill, you may or may not know that birds, when they are frightened or scared, they will collapse their wings and plummet to the earthwards, because that's where they look upon safety. Unfortunately, this bird was in my sort of 2 o'clock high, and as you can see, came straight through the canopy. It damaged me a little bit, but my equipment quite a lot, as you'll see in a moment, and obviously the aircraft quite a lot, because some of that perspex we found out later actually went into the engine, and although the engine kept on working happily, as far as we could tell, it obviously caused some damage. You can also see, well, might be able to see from this picture, there's a blast screen between the front cockpit and the rear cockpit to prevent exactly problems like this. But the problem was that most of the bird remains had splattered across that blast screen. So the instructor in the back, albeit he was the captain of the aircraft, he couldn't actually see out to land the aircraft. So he had to rely on me doing that because he couldn't see. The other thing from my point of view, you may have seen in pictures that the Hawk has like a zigzag in the canopy at above, and that's what's known as miniature detonating cord. And in the event of an ejection, normally, as you pull the handle, that will fire first. Then the ejection seat will go through the hole that's been made by it. Unfortunately, because the bird broke the canopy, most of that wire, that miniature detonating cord, was actually wrapping itself around me. So I was quite concerned, should we subsequently have had to eject, what that cord was going to do as I pulled the handle. So it was a little bit of concern for me at that point. That's what my helmet looked like afterwards. We always had two visors, a clear visor for all we always had down, and the dark visor obviously for when it was sunny. And as you can see, my clear visor was down, but there was still quite a lot of damage done to that. And my dark visor was up, but it took most of the brute force. And you can see this side of it, the right-hand side of the dark visor is completely gone, who knows where. And you can see quite a lot of damage to the helmet itself. So it was an interesting afternoon, to say the least. But most importantly, as I say, we safely landed at the end of it. So over 30 years, lots of little mishaps, nothing major. And as I say, the same number of takeoffs and landings. And I've had my final trip in a Hawk in what was now 2009, I think it was. I thought it was my final trip in the Air Force, but it wasn't. As you can see on the right-hand side, my final trip in the Air Force was to be picked up by the search and rescue helicopter and delivered to the officers' mess for a few drinks at the end of the day. I was quite lucky in as much as about 3 weeks before this event, the rules had been changed because they'd learned a bit more about people getting cold and wet and coming to grief in cold lakes in the winter. And the search and rescue people had been specifically told not to get people wet if they could help it. Prior to that point, they would have dunked me in the lake, which is just below where my feet are dangling at the moment. As it happened, they lowered me almost to the lake and then stopped. And fortunately, I arrived at the bar a lot drier than I thought I was going to. But they then delivered me the mess and we had a few drinks at the end of the day. And Kate came and joined me as well. So 30 years, 5,500 hours, over 2,000 hours instruction in all manner of aircraft, and about overall probably about 20 to 25 different aircraft I've flown as captain over the years. That brings me to the end of my very short and rushed through, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions that any of you have to ask.
That's wonderful, Bob. Thank you. My life feels so mundane. Okay, so if you could just switch off your screen.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And then I can see everybody. Okay, wonderful. Right, if you have a question, please go ahead. Put your hand up so I can see you and go ahead and unmute. Does Rodney have a question? No, sorry. Well, I have a question, Bob, while everybody else is thinking of one. I'm just wondering, now that the days of sort of self-driving cars are upon us, how long do you think before we have self-flying fighter planes? Because surely you could redesign the plane because you wouldn't have to worry about G-forces and having to put a pilot into it. And surely that would be a huge competitive advantage for the first country that comes up with one.
Well, they are well on their way, I have to say. We've already have drones, which you're probably aware of, which are relatively slow but long. Certainly can do the reconnaissance job like I did for long periods of time. There will at some point be a combat aircraft that's without a pilot. The next expected aircraft in the UK Royal Air Force is expected to have both. So they're going to have a cockpit for a pilot to fly in it, but also some of the aircraft will be able to be flown without a pilot as well. So that time is coming, and it's probably not that far away. The only problem I foresee in that is, as much as with operations like we've done over the years, like in Ethiopia, like in Iraq and also Croatia and Serbia, that sort of area, you often need the pilot in the loop to be able to make the important decisions and to really decide exactly what they're looking at is correct, because it's very easy to misinterpret some things that you see through video and lenses and zoom and things like television and stuff. So I think we've got a little way to go before the pilot will be completely out of it, but I think that day will come, I suspect.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from members?
Looks like David has a question.
Yes, David, please go ahead.
Thanks, Farmdeep. On Saturday morning, I was sat at a cafe and the Red Arrows went over on their way somewhere, not performing. How important are the Red Arrows to the RAF, and did you ever think of signing up?
The Red Arrows are very important because they do a wonderful job of public relations around the world. It's often said within RAF circles that they'll be the last squadron to survive the Air Force if it was ever cut out, because no one, certainly politicians wise, ever wants to be the ones to cut out the Red Arrows, because publicly wise, they're the most well-known and popular people. They do a great job. They do a good job for selling British wares around the world, but the problem I see is that we're getting a smaller and smaller Air Force, and it's becoming more and more difficult to justify them. Did I ever think of joining? I don't think there's a fast jet pilot in the world that hasn't actually thought about joining these sort of things. Yes, I did. I did join them as an examiner, as I mentioned earlier, and I still train them in the simulator. But unfortunately, it all depends on timing as well. Because of promotions and things, the time I could have joined them, I was due for promotion, and I had to choose the promotion route rather than the Red Arrows route, which probably, hindsight, may have been nicer, may have been more fun, but these things are choices you make at the time. I don't regret that, but it is quite a commitment they do. They each do 3 years on the Red Arrows. It is, when in normal times, obviously non-COVID times, they are away for most summer weekends and significant parts of the winter as well. Sometimes they're often preparing for long overseas tours towards the end or the beginning of their seasons. So it is quite a demand on themselves and their families as well.
Thank you.
Bernard, please go ahead. You just need to unmute yourself.
Have you flown off carriers at all? And do you think the 2 new carriers that we've got are as vulnerable as they look? Huge, great things that look as if they're very vulnerable to attack and sinking.
The simple answer to the first bit, Bernard, is no. I've not flown off a carrier. It was one thing as a pilot I always wanted to do, was to make an approach to an aircraft carrier, because the challenge of that must be quite fantastic. Are they vulnerable? Any big ship anywhere in the world is vulnerable nowadays, and the problem I personally find with carriers is, and this is an RAF person speaking, I hasten to add, but the problem I have is that it takes a lot of other ships to defend that one carrier, and it's if they don't do that job properly, a lot of assets get lost in one fell swoop. So they are vulnerable. They do have some superb defensive weaponry, and obviously, as I say, they will never go anywhere without a large number of ships around them to protect them.
Okay, thank you. We can have one final question if anybody has one. No. Okay, right. I will pass to Chris Mitchell. Go ahead, Christopher.
Thank you, Bob. I think my only qualification for giving this, you hear me? Yeah. My only qualification for giving this vote, I think, is my only qualification for giving this vote, I think, is 25 minutes rather terrifying in the back seat of a Spitfire. 25 minutes rather terrifying in the back seat of a Spitfire. It makes
Sorry, Chris, just to stop you there.
tame compared with yours.
Bob, could you just mute yourself? I think there's some feedback.
Yours was your one about the Liberator, and you trying to fly your Jaguar slowly enough to keep up with it without falling out of the sky. That must have been quite a test. I think you must have flown more fast jets than most of us have had cars, but you've certainly had a very exciting career, and thank you very much for sharing it with us. And can we all show our appreciation in the usual way?
Thank you very much, Bob. That was really great. Okay, attendance today.
Palmdeep, before we finish, could I add an invitation to members?
Of course.
You probably, as Rotarians, you probably know that there are some 70 fellowships for all sorts of hobbies. I belong to the International Fellowship of Flying Rotarians, and if you've been interested in the talk that Bob's given today, the Flying Fellowship has a monthly talk. Next Thursday, on Thursday the 1st of July, there's a talk by the pilot of Chinook who broke up approaching the Scottish coast. He was one of 2 survivors out of 49 people. So I think that's going to be a very interesting talk about flying oil rig helicopters. Next Thursday, the 1st of July, 7:30 in the evening. And if you'd like an invitation to attend that, please let me know and I'll invite you as my guest. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rodney. If everybody could just go ahead and unmute themselves, just so we can say goodbye to each other. So attendance is 20, as I said. I'll just quickly say hello to Shalin. Have I said that right, Muriel?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you. Yes. I just have a quick question to ask Bob. Am I allowed to ask it now?
If Bob's still here, yes, go ahead.
Yes. Have there been any parts of your pilot training which you have found particularly challenging? So currently I'm in the commercial modular pilot training routes, and something which I found really difficult were the ground school examinations, the EASA exams. So have there been any certain particular military pilot training difficulties you've come across in your career?
Hello, Sharon. It's a very difficult question to answer that, because everybody finds aspects of flying training difficult at different times, partly because of the intensity of it, and partly because of their time how they are at the time, whether they're tired otherwise. Probably, I think the fairest way to put it is that air combat training is probably one of the hardest, because it's physically demanding as well as mentally demanding, because you're trying to keep a 3D picture of yourself, of where you are, where the other aircraft are, and how you can put yourself into a position of advantage. So I think probably from a fighter pilot point of view, the air defense or air combat side of things was probably the most demanding. But ground school is always difficult, because there's a lot of information to take in, and it's important to keep plodding on and keep working at it, because although it's tedious sometimes, getting the ground school out the way and that knowledge in your brain is obviously the first step to making sure everything else works properly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, attendance 20, and we'd normally have Richard Power here to give us an update on the COVID situation locally, but he's not with us today, and I hope he'll be joining us again soon. Just before I finish up, And yes, so next week it's going to be handover, as I mentioned before. So please come along and support Scott, and I will be handing over to him, hopefully live. We'll be trying our best to do that. And it looks like the hybrid meeting format has worked okay. Quite pleased. So there haven't been any major hiccups today. So I think we're good to continue with that. All I have left to say is there are no meetings after lunch, and I hope to see you all next week. Stay well, stay safe.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Bob.